Yes, Sam.
Okay. Okay, if I can have everyone's attention, I just want to say welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I also want to say thank you very much to the Justice 404 class for allowing us to bring your class to a wider audience. I understand there's now 35 people online. Is that correct, Alyssa? 39, okay, we're growing. Before I begin, of course, I have to acknowledge the fact that we are on Coast Salish territory. This is the territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt people, and it is with their graciousness that we are allowed to work, live, and play here. So with that, I hope wherever you are in the wider world, you can also send out an acknowledgement to the territory that you're on yourself. I'm very excited today that we are able to bring this discussion to you on an introduction to international humanitarian law. And I am very privileged and honored that we have had the Canadian Red Cross agree to come and talk to us about this, as they are the shepherds of the Geneva Conventions. I also would like to acknowledge the fact that we have Ashoka Changemakers in the room for a part of the day. So welcome to Royal Roads University, and I hope you enjoy your stay. As we go forward, we do have Sophie Rondeau, who is going to be presenting to us. She is coming from Quebec herself. But before I introduce Sophie, I also want to acknowledge the work and support of other Canadian Red Cross people. Michael Stevens, the program advisor for humanitarian education, is with us online, as is Joanne Abshar, the coordinator of communications and public engagement, and they've been very supportive of putting this together, so I thank them. And now I'd like to introduce Sophie. Sophie has graduated from the Université de Montréal Law Faculty. She holds a master's degree in international law from the Université de Quebec and is a member of the Quebec Bar. She has worked in the field of international justice, human rights, and international humanitarian law in institutions such as the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, Rights and Democracy, and also, of course, the Canadian Red Cross, and the Jean Piquet competition. She's also currently a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Law in the University of Geneva. Welcome, Sophie. I hand it over to you now.
Thank you. Uh, Thank you very much, Kathleen, for the kind introduction. If there's any problem with the audio, just wave or whatever you can, because I'm all alone in my office right now. So it's a bit difficult. As I thought of it prior to this event, the personal connection with the student is always something that I enjoy. But I think that right now it's a really nice experience. We can reach out to a lot of people. And I want to thank you for being in the room, being online. And I hope we'll have a nice discussion in the next hour and a half. And we can talk about IHL. I want to mention a quick thing. You heard an audio glitch just before I joined. It's because I feel like a character in a TV series that I like a lot. So in the Rick and Morty, if you don't know that TV show, there's a big extraterrestrial body, a big yellow head in the sky that asks people, show me what you got. And it's kind of a talent show where people do their little skit and their little number. That's how I feel right now, because from the scale perspective, I see that my face is really big on the screen. So please be kind. I'll try to behave. And I don't want to intervene too much. You can show me what you got at the question period if you would like to, and we can move on to humanitarian law. So we'll start with the slide. So I'll give you a quick overview of the presentation. The way that I've set it up is for about an hour, and then we can have 30 minutes of question afterwards, more or less. We can keep it flexible. The key focus is really international humanitarian law. But I'm going to address with you with a few slides the history of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, because as Kathleen mentioned, they're closely intertwined. The role of the movement of the Red Cross is very close to the existence of the Geneva Convention and all the rules applicable in armed conflict. So that's why I need to set the stage on that. And then we can move into really the subject of what is IHL and what is it not. So all through the presentation, I'm not going to tackle that in a specific slide, but that's the idea behind the presentation, is why is the respect for international humanitarian law important? Is it still something that's relevant? We'll look over the basic rules. I have a short 5-minute video that I think is very useful. I have a few slides on that. I'm not going to go into too much details. And then I picked 4 focus points that we can discuss just to illustrate some of the challenges, some of the strength, and also just current situation of complexity, some of very high level of complexity to look at international humanitarian law. So focus on incendiary and chemical weapons in Syria, a focus on ICC, the International Criminal Court, as one of accountability mechanism for war crimes. Another focus on healthcare providers in armed conflict, a subject that's very key in the Red Cross movement these days because we have an operational consideration for that that's very important. And the last focus will be war at the root of hunger. So one of the elements that was mentioned when I was preparing this presentation was the complexity of armed conflict. So that shows kind of that complexity where you do have drought or different situation as part of an armed conflict. And then I have a few closing slides, and then we can move on to the questions. So history of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. The Red Cross was born out in the battlefield. The man that you see at the bottom with the very funky beard right here is Henri Dunant. That's the founder of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And he was not a humanitarian at the start of his career. He was a merchant, and he was traveling through Europe trying to find, to have contractual agreement to build pipes in Italy at that time. And in 1859, he came across the Battle of Solferino. And that's the painting that you see here. He saw all of those men and all of those horses just spread out under like kilometers and just suffering. And it really, really challenged him. He said, why are we leaving those men to die in the field like that? Why isn't there any mechanism to just alleviate the suffering of those people? They can no longer fight. It's no longer about war. It's about human being. So he picked up all of the men he could. He took the women in the villages nearby, and he brought everybody in the church, but that was not enough for him. When he came back to Geneva, he did write a book. You can read it. It's Un souvenir de Solferino. That's Henri Dunant's account of what he encountered at the Battle of Solferino. But he also said, we need an entity, an international body to actually protect those people no longer fighting in war. And we also need a convention. So that's where he got together with 4 of his colleagues, Monnier, Appia, Dufour, and I'm missing the last one. So you have the 4 names over there, but they got together and they created the International Committee of the Red Cross. And they also, so that was in 1863. In 1864, we had the first Geneva Convention. So one of the key elements here is everything moved really quickly. There was a momentum at that time that most of the states and most of the international community as it stands at that time wanted to have those protective measures. So that political element is also interesting, that it really, really moved really fast. You can see that the Geneva Convention that we're currently working with were adopted in 1949. I'll come back to those a little bit later because the context, of course, as you know, is very different. So that's one way of presenting the Red Cross movement. A few key elements on that slide that's important for you to understand the place of humanitarian law, but also the role of the Red Cross in implementing it. So you do see that the International Committee of the Red Cross is there. That's always the lead agency in situations of armed conflict. So you'll see that's why I'll refer to the RCRC a little bit more than the other components. You have the National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. So in the world, there's 196 states member of the UN, and I think more or less there's 192 national society. So this is what the local organization, that's what the people who live in the country actually do. I'm a member of the Canadian Red Cross. I worked in the Canadian Red Cross, and you have those national societies all across the world. So in time of peace and in time of war, to the limit of the capacity of the national society, because when a society is under war, the resources are more limited, they're always active. The RCRC will come in when an armed conflict arises, but always working in collaboration with the national society. That's one of the strengths of the movement. The other component, which we'll not tackle too much today, but I do want to mention, it's the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. That's the overarching organization that allows to mobilize all of those strengths, so national society, RCRC, and all of those other components, to come and help in situation of high intensity of vulnerability. So when there's an earthquake, hurricane, and so on, the Federation will come and will coordinate the action of the stronger national society. The Canadian Red Cross is one that has more resources and actually help, a situation that is a little bit weaker. Another important element of the movement of the Red Cross you see at the top is that state party to the Geneva Convention are part of the movement. So it's not just an international organization, and it's not just a state organization. Every 4 years, all of those components meet in Geneva and they draft resolution. They have discussion always under the umbrella of humanitarian consideration. So when you have resolution from the Red Cross movement from those every 4-year meetings, from the general meeting that they have been reviewed, commented, and criticized by state. So one of the criticism that we can have regarding humanitarian law, human rights, or different corpuses, states sometimes don't really care and they're not involved. I think that's something that's valid. That's a valid criticism. But as part of the Red Cross and within humanitarian consideration, there is a role and a responsibility for states to actually address those issues that are brought up by the humanitarian community, and they're part of that whole component of the movement. You'll see that's something that I'll come back to it. The rules of law, as I'm going to present them to you, it's not the Red Cross that actually drafted it. It's all of the state that decided that those rules needed to be set up in an environment where we can wage war within the limits of humanity. So these are the fundamental principles of the Red Cross. We can spend 1 minute and we can spend 45 minutes on those, but these are the key principles that we have. Humanity is a key one. Impartiality and neutrality, I'll come back to it on the next slide regarding the role of the RCRC, but that's something that's very key to the Red Cross and also very unique. Our work is complementary with other organizations that might do advocacy work, a little bit more denunciation, going public, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, even MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, do more advocacy work. But the way that the Red Cross movement works is to actually establish a confidential bilateral dialogue with authorities that detain and that can actually impose suffering and diminish the conditions of civilian population or combatant. So that neutrality and that impartiality is very key. If you have a question on the fundamental principle at the question period, feel free to ask them. So focusing more on the International Committee of the Red Cross working principles, as you can see, neutrality, independence, and impartiality is key. One of the reasons for that is that a war is a man-made disaster. So you do need those balance of impartiality and neutrality. The Red Cross will talk to all of the parties to the conflict and will always have a humanitarian agenda, always trying to alleviate the suffering of people wherever it can be found. So those principles are really, really important. The mandate of the International Committee of the Red Cross is exclusively humanitarian, and it's based in the Geneva Convention and also the Statute of the movement. The ICRC has a role in development of IHL and interpretation. When you would see them in the field, so really operation, they bear no weapons, and they always have that confidential dialogue that I mentioned. That's really an important. The Red Cross is the protection of the international delegate. It's the only protection, never bearing any weapon. And you will see in the focus points that I've raised, that's a big issue now for the delegates. The scene has changed a lot, and the fact of not being protected by weapon is something that's a big issue, but it still is important for the Red Cross movement. The activities that the RCRC does, and I won't go into too much detail because it's more of a presentation on IHL, are protection, assistance, and prevention. In peacetime, the RCRC is also present. So they do a dialogue with the state. The state is the entity that has the responsibility to enforce the rules of law, international humanitarian law. So the work on national implementation of international law is key, becoming parties to treaty. I did mention that the Geneva Convention have been ratified by all the states in the world, so 196 parties, but there are other treaties banning weapons and the additional protocol that I'll come back to it. So one of the work is to encourage states to become parties to this treaty and also adapt the domestic legislation. So all the pieces that can come together to protect vulnerable population in time of war, they're going to be addressed by the ICRC in their peacetime operation. There's also integrating applicable law into the operational practice of armed forces. So not just training the military that are eventually going to be deployed, but actually working at the policy level, the doctrine, education, field training, discipline, and justice. So this is a wide range of activities. During armed conflict, there's a protection dialogue that takes place with state and also non-state armed groups. So the different subjects are here: humanitarian access, detention, conduct of hostility, and they act as a neutral intermediary and ensure IHL respect of partner forces. So that kind of gives you a general idea of the different pieces of how the RCA works in the field. These are, I have a few slides on the different emblems. So you have the cross, the crescent, and the red crystal. So the cross and the crescents do not have religious connotation, but they can appear to have one. And that was one of the problems that the Red Cross was faced, especially in occupied territory in Israel, where using the Red Cross or the Red Crescent present a big issue to access to the victim. So the solution was not to force an emblem, even if there is no connotation to any religious thing. It was to find a solution to gain access to the victim. So the solution was to create a new emblem. It took, I think, 15 years of negotiation to add a protocol to the Geneva Convention to have the red crystal. So it might be an emblem that you might see in the field in armed conflicts. It has the same protective value as the Red Cross and the Red Crescent. I have a slide with the logo, so it tells you the different, you have the RCRC logo and the International Federation. So these are the different permutation that you can have of the logos and the emblem. So on use of the emblem, you might see them, they should be displayed on medical building and medical vehicles. That's a protective emblem, the really big emblem. You also have indicative use for the emblem that you wear on armband, a badge, or a bib. That's for healthcare personnel, but also the Red Cross personnel. And you do have a few issues on healthcare. I'll come back to it on it because that's not necessarily the focus here. So let's dive into what is international humanitarian law. So one important distinction to start with is the difference between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. A little trick that we always teach to our student in law school is jus in bello, it's inside. So it's law inside of the armed conflict. The law that actually governs and determines the rules of war, the way that you conduct hostility. That's international humanitarian law. That's the way you wage war. Jus ad bellum, it determines when it is legal to use force. And that's something that's contained into the UN Charter. So when you have an armed conflict, you always have two parties. So one party will be wrong and one party will be right, at least in terms of legal term, meaning that war is prohibited under the UN Charter. So if somebody starts a war, then it constitutes a breach of the UN Charter. There are exceptions under the Charter. So crime of aggression, legitimate defense, self-defense, and also international security, a threat to international security. So you can see that it's really hard to determine when you're right and when you're wrong. Who started it? Who's to blame? That's what jus ad bellum deals with. In jus in bello, we don't look at the reasons why an armed conflict was started. We look at facts. We look at different facts, and we say if an armed conflict, if a situation has reached the threshold of an armed conflict, then the rules apply to everybody. All the parties involved need to respect the rule, either if they're right or wrong. At that point, everybody needs to abide to those rules. Because why? Because it's going to protect everybody. Those rules of humanitarian law benefit all of the parties to the conflict, and you can still wage war in a way that you can gain your cause if you feel that your cause is right. So that's kind of the framework. So that distinction is very important, at least from a legal perspective, but also a very practical element. So the UN Charter and IHL, which is mostly the Geneva Convention and their additional protocols. Another distinction is between human rights and international humanitarian law. So human rights apply in time of peace as well as in times of armed conflict. The difference, IHL will only apply in times of armed conflict. One of the reasons for that is pretty simple, is it's a pessimistic body of law. It's a body of law that allows you to shoot another combatant, which you don't want to have happen in the peacetime. So you do want your police forces in times of peace to use a gradation of means. So escalation in use of force. You don't have that requirement in armed conflict. So the rules are very different, and you don't necessarily, even as an IHL lawyer, that's not a body of law that I want to apply. It applies when it's actually needed and the population needs that protection. That being said, human rights will apply throughout all that continuum of peace and armed conflict. There are some human rights that can be suspended. One of the example is freedom of movement. So having a curfew in time of war, it's not something that goes against human rights per se. It is an infringement upon freedom of movement, but it can be limited because it's for the security of the population. So that's that interplay between human rights and international humanitarian law. Freedom of reunion also can be limited, and you can have an interesting theoretical and also practical discussion on the right to life. So since you can actually shoot your opponent, shoot to kill, well, the right to life is limited in a way. But you do have you never have the right to torture, you never have to legally detain, and so on and so on. So all those common sense human rights, they still apply all the time. When you study international law, you'll tackle that issue when you talk about lex specialis. That's the concept of which law applies first. Usually IHL will say, well, IHL is more specific, it's less specialist, then it will apply, but then some human rights standards will apply. That body of law, that interaction evolved a lot in the last 20 years or so. It's something that really, really changed. I think, maybe 20 years ago, you would have in this kind of presentation, not from the Red Cross, but saying that human rights would not apply in armed conflict, that only IHL will apply. So that's a more of a theoretical element. Another important distinction is between armed conflict and natural disaster. So armed conflict is international humanitarian law, but natural disasters, although the context might be similar, it's the human rights law. Right now, I know that the Red Cross and the Federation have been involved into developing a body of law that addresses a natural disaster in a more coherent way, but that's another body of law. So I just wanted to put that. As I said, I'm giving you like a broad picture with different pieces of the puzzle. So that's another piece of the puzzle to understand the broader context. So when does IHL apply? That's something that's very key in international humanitarian law. It applies in international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. So international armed conflict is a conflict waged between two states. So that's full application of treaty and custom, full or limited human rights law. It's the 4 Geneva Convention that were adopted in 1949, and it's the first additional protocol that's been adopted in 1977. Non-international armed conflict, so a conflict waged between a state and a non-state armed groups, or two state armed groups, or different state armed groups, that's a non-international armed conflict. You have one common article in the 4 Geneva Convention. So it's one article, Article 3, that you find in the Geneva Convention of 1949, and possibly the additional Protocol 2 that was also adopted in 1977. So it's it's the different law that protects it. Same thing with human rights and domestic law as well that can apply. Situation of internal tension or disturbance, usually that happened before an armed conflict or even after. I mean, that's a continuum that's very flexible and organic. There's no application of IHL, and it's mostly human rights that take on. Another thing is international humanitarian law splits in two different groups. So Geneva law that deals with protected person demands human treatment. So it's mostly the law that will protect the civilian population. And you have Hague law. Hague law deals with the means and method of warfare. So it limits the conduct of hostility, the type of weapon you can use, the type of strategy you can use. It really addresses the way that the combatant actually develop their strategy within the armed conflict. Geneva law will kind of address the situation of people that don't want to be part of the conflict but are stuck there. They're stuck in between, so it's to limit as much as possible the negative effect of the armed conflict on those people. I'll go, after that slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail of telling you more about the Geneva Convention, the protocol, the dynamic. You'll see I mentioned international armed conflict, non-international armed conflict. But for me, and that's my interpretation I can say it because I'm doing a PhD now, so I can put on my academic hat. That's for me, that is what the IHL is. It's very simple. It's to find a right balance between humanitarian consideration and military necessity. International humanitarian law is a body of law that applies only in times of armed conflict. It states how those taking part in hostility must behave and require that the adversary be respected. So the early rules were a matter of custom. They were established by the civilization of the day. Other rules emerged from religious, from ethical sources, such as the Bible, the Quran. It's always been around because war is kind of an ontological foundation of state and also of humanity. So modern humanitarian law, as I mentioned earlier, was founded in 1864 with Henri Dunant, and it enshrines one basic rule: spare anyone on the battlefield who is not taking part in hostility. That's the bottom line. Over the time, the law scope broadened to protect other people affected by the conflict and to impose restriction on the way war was waged. One of the main purposes of humanitarian law is to protect victims of armed conflict. So it contains provision that specifically protect the wounded, the sick, and healthcare personnel. So for me, it's not just about humanitarian consideration. You're waging war, so there are military necessity, but you always need to keep that balance in mind. As a Red Cross worker, as a humanitarian, I'll always push for the humanitarian consideration, but I can also engage into a dialogue with the military and the parties to the conflict to understand how, within what framework and within what limits, they can actually wage war in a way that's more human or that limits the impact on the population. So that's the slide. I'll leave it on because it has a lot of information. It tells you about the state party to the Geneva Convention. As I mentioned, those conventions were adopted in 1949. If we're putting it back into its historical context, humanity was shocked by the atrocity of the Second World War. So it was really a shock reaction to adopt rules that never again would what happened in the Second World War would take place. So the focus was really international armed conflict, state versus state. That reality of having non-state armed groups was not necessarily prohibited in that time. So the Geneva Convention really embodied that spirit that you can find in 1949 for international armed conflict. You'll have the Third Geneva Convention that really addressed prisoners of war statutes because it was a big thing during the Second World War, and so on. As I mentioned, those conventions are for international armed conflict, and all the states that are a member of the UN have ratified those treaties. So if we come back to my second slide, all of the states at the UN are member of the movement of the Red Cross. That's a big plus, and we're really building on it. When we're asking ourselves, is it still relevant? Yes, of course, if all the rules that are contained in the Geneva Convention today would be respected, I would have a very, very little work to do. I would have to find another field of law, maybe move into more human rights. You do have the additional protocol that were adopted in 1977. So once again, if we put it back into the context of the historical context, 1977 was very different than 1949. We're right after the war of colonization, Vietnam. So the context is very, very different. So it gives us two different protocols. The protocol 1, which addresses international armed conflict, but from a perspective of occupation and also war of liberation. So it fleshes out a little bit more the place of the protection that is needed for the civilian population. And you also have the second additional protocol, which fleshes out all of the rules for non-international armed conflict. So these days we have that common Article 3 that I mentioned earlier in all the 4 Geneva Convention that sets kind of the basic rules, and the additional protocol, that's the corpus of law that is more relevant today because we have less and less international armed conflict between two states. So that's why for me this map is very useful in those kind of presentation. You can see that 2/3 of the states have ratified the Geneva Protocol. I'm looking at the number, it's 167. You can actually see that most of the key states, such as the US and Israel and so on, and a lot of African states did not ratify the second protocol. So all of those rules applying to non-international armed conflict do not apply to those states. But you do have an interplay between the rules that you find in the Geneva Convention and a lot of dialogue and discussion going on that. So it's important to understand that mechanism and also the key role that the states play in that. So that map for me is pretty useful for the political content and also the context of Geneva Convention and the additional protocol. Let me just look. Yeah. So who are the protected people? International humanitarian law protects a wide range of people and objects during armed conflict. So the Geneva Convention and Protocol, they protect the sick, the wounded, the shipwrecked, the persons not taking part in hostilities, the prisoners of wars and other detainees, the civilian and civilian objects. Parties to a conflict are prohibited to target civilian, and they're required to take all feasible measures to avoid attacks that result in civilian casualty. They are also required to avoid defensive measures that put the civilian in danger. A civilian may not be used as protective shields or forcibly displaced. Unnecessary attack on their means of livelihood, such as the farm, their housing, transport, health facility, all of that is forbidden by international humanitarian law. IHL also mentions specific protection among civilians, such as women, who must be protected from sexual abuse, and children whose specific needs need to be taken into account by the combatant. So that's what you find in the Geneva Convention, the protocol. IHL also protects, although with a complementary of the other legal regime, refugees, internally displaced people, and those who have gone missing as a result of an armed conflict. It also protects humanitarian workers, such as ICR, International Committee of the Red Cross staff, Red Cross volunteers and delegates, and the personnel of individual national society. So these organizations can use the emblem. The example that we have here is just that these are the current situation where the protected people are in the most need of humanitarian assistance, but also enforcements of the rule contained in the Geneva Convention that all the states in the world need to abide to. So just previous. So with that in mind, I want to show you a 5-minute video that was made by the RCRC, and it gives you the general overview of the basic rule of international humanitarian law. I'm a very visual person, so that's how I like to learn. That's why I'm going to show it to you. And then I have a couple of slides where I come back on a few principles. And we can move on that, and then we can look at the different focus that I have, and you'll have kind of the different pieces of the puzzle. So if you can put the move. So that's how I like to learn. That's why I'm going to show it to you. And then I have a couple of slides where I come back on a few principles. And we can move on that, and then we can look at the different focus that I have, and you'll have kind of the different pieces of the puzzle. So if you can put the move.
Since the beginning, humans have resorted to violence as a way to settle disagreements. Yet through the ages, people from around the world have tried to limit the brutality of war. It was this humanitarian spirit that led to the first Geneva Convention of 1864 and to the birth of modern international humanitarian law. Setting the basic limits on how wars can be fought, these universal laws of war protect those not fighting, as well as those no longer able to. To do this, a distinction must always be made between who or what may be attacked and who or what must be spared and protected. Most importantly, civilians can never be targeted. To do so is a war crime.
When they drove into our village, they shouted that they were going to kill everyone. I was so scared. I ran to hide in the bush. I heard my mother screaming. I thought I would never see her again.
Every possible care must be taken to avoid harming civilians or destroying things essential for their survival. They have a right to receive the help they need.
the conditions prisoners lived in never used to bother me. People like him were the reason my brother was dead. He was the enemy and was nothing to me. But then I realized that behind bars, he was out of action and no longer a threat to me and my family.
The laws of war prohibit torture and other ill treatment of detainees, whatever their past. They must be given food and water and allowed to communicate with loved ones. This preserves their dignity and keeps them alive. Medical workers save lives, sometimes in the most dangerous conditions.
Fighters from both sides were wounded in a deadly battle. We were taking them to the nearest hospital. At a checkpoint, a soldier threatened us to treat his men only. We were running out of time, and I was afraid that now all of them were going to die.
Medical workers must always be allowed to do their job, and the Red Cross or Red Crescent must not be attacked. The sick or wounded have a right to be cared for, regardless of whose side they are on. Advances in weapons technology have meant that the rules of war have also had to adapt. Because some weapons and methods of warfare don't distinguish between fighters and civilians, limits on their use have been agreed. In the future, wars may be fought with fully autonomous robots. But will such robots ever have the ability to distinguish between a military target and someone who must never be attacked? No matter how sophisticated weapons become, it is essential that they are in line with the rules of war. International humanitarian law is all about making choices that preserve a minimum of human dignity in times of war and make sure that living together again is possible once the last bullet has been shot.
I think that means I'm back on. Is it good? Can you hear me? That's good. Can you hear me well?
Okay, we can hear you now.
Excellent. Good. Okay, so thank you for watching that video. Usually I quickly go around when I'm in person to ask if there's any feedback, because it's just a cartoon, but it contains everything that's very important in IHL, but also challenging to look at. So if you want to, if there's anything that came up in that video that you actually want to talk about during the question period, more than welcome. For me, it's really an addition. It's a different way of presenting IHL, but it also had that humanitarian aspect that I like. It presents a few issues that are challenging, but in a way that it's not too invasive. So next slide. So I'm going to do that a little bit quickly because you saw it in the video, so I don't want to repeat it, but sometimes saying it in different words helps us keep that in our head. So the Hague Law, as I mentioned earlier, these are the means and methods of warfare. So the principle of distinction is very key. It's fundamental in humanitarian law. You need to distinguish yourself if you're a combatant, because then you can be protected or not. So parties to the conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and the combatant, and between the civilian objects and the military objective, and accordingly shall direct their operation only against military objective. So that's the principle of distinction. It's the cardinal principle of humanitarian law. Also, attacks must not be directed against specifically protected object and person. So these are personnes hors combat, out of combat, so no longer fighting. The Red Cross and Red Crescent, medical, religious, object and personnel, and cultural property. You also have the basic rule of proportionality. So that's another element of means and methods of warfare. The belligerent must refrain from deciding to launch any attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilian, damage to civilian object, or a combination thereof, which would be an excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. So that's exactly that's one of the elements that comes out from the balance, the slide with military objective and humanitarian consideration. The proportionality is really key to that element. Now, if we're looking from a theoretical or legal perspective, the principle of proportionality is really being questioned, not because it's ill-founded, but because it's really, really hard to implement it. There are many, many different ways to decide what would be collateral damage, what would be excessive damage in relation to a concrete military advantage, what is a military advantage. So right now, I think it's a fruitful dialogue that you have between the military and the humanitarian, with the civilian population kind of in between. So in some situation, proportionality is not a big issue. And these are, I can say, these are the cases that don't make the news. I mean, it's a good news. Sometimes it's pretty easy. There's an attack on a compound in the desert, but you'll see in the slide on the different focus, that's not the case in Syria. That's not the case in the pictures that you see here. So the proportionality principle is really key, but it's also very, very hard. It's very challenging to adapt it, but it still is part. It's part of the rules that the states agreed to abide to, and it's part of the corpus of humanitarian law. So in terms of means and methods of warfare, those engaged in the fighting, they must exercise distinction, which includes doing everything feasible to verify that the objective to be attacked are not protected from attack. And they execute an attack which is proportionate, which includes taking all feasible precautions, so precaution is another very important element, to choose means and method of attack that avoids incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilian, and damage to civilian object. One example I can give, you just saw it in the video, those what some people call the killing robots. So is a robot, is it a way to engage into warfare that will respect the principle of precaution, distinction, and proportionality? That's an ongoing debate. That's something that you can look at from a very practical perspective, and also from a theoretical, from an academic perspective. It's a subject that is tackled a lot these days. So with those kind of weaponry that blurs that line between a combatant and the weapon itself. So that's a recap. These are other slides. I did like the visual on that. So IHL only applies in time of armed conflict, and it limits the means and methods of warfare. It's governed by the principle of distinction, so that military objective versus a civilian object, and it prohibits indiscriminate attacks. It's another way of saying it. That picture is from Syria, if I'm not mistaken. It's governed by proportionality. It reasons for conflict do no affect protections. Persons who are not engaged in the fighting are afforded protection, and there's responsibility for breaches. I'll look on that when I talk about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, a little bit later. So the first focus, as I said, I have 4 elements of focus. The way that I drafted it is I just look at the notes that we've been exchanging when preparing this presentation, and it's mostly maybe to feed the way that you perceive IHL, but also maybe in the question period. So if you have any questions, these are subjects that we are discussing within the Red Cross these days that are important, and it's also raising awareness on situations that we can actually influence because they're going on right now. So the first focus is on incendiary and chemical weapons in Syria. I'll be going back and forth on the slides because I wasn't sure the order I would put them in, so I'll show them out to you at once. So here you have 2 pictures. The first one, at least 4 incendiary submunition burned on the ground of a narrow street in the Al-Masad neighborhood. That's in the opposition-held east part of the city in Aleppo, immediately after an incendiary weapon attack was deployed on August 7, 2016. So incendiary weapons have been banned under the 1980 Convention on Prohibition of Conventional Weapons. But they're still being used. That's one of the reality. You do have rules of law. One of the problems is the enforcement, but the solution to that is not necessarily not have any rules of law. It's more of the political mechanism, but we can talk about that a little bit later. The second picture, it's not a good quality, but I wanted to put it in that context so we can think about it. It's footage showing what Human Rights Watch armed experts have identified as incendiary bomb. I won't give you the whole name, like the RBK2, or it's a prohibited incendiary weapon that's mounted on a Russian attack aircraft at a Russian airbase in Syria on June 18, 2016. So that's actual footage and proof that those weapons have been used. So what do we do with that information? How do we address it from a legal perspective? That's as a complement of information, I want to share that with you. Biological and chemical weapons, you've seen there were attacks in Syria recently with chemical weapon that really shocked the international community, probably seeing it in the media. You have Physician for Human Rights that also addressed it very thoroughly. Those weapons are already banned. So there are already international convention prohibiting biological weapon, chemical weapon, the landmines. Landmine is the Ottawa Treaty that was negotiated in 1997. Canada was instrumental into the very successful humanitarian arms dealing convention, and cluster munition as well. That's 2008, a very similar format as the landmine convention. But there is no convention on nuclear weapons. So that's another element. The international community must address this legal anomaly. That's the position of the Red Cross. As we see, we have a humanitarian agenda. From a humanitarian agenda, having a nuclear weapon makes no sense whatsoever. The proportionality, the principle of distinction is not respected. From a political perspective, from a military advantage, there are a lot of arguments being made by the state that do have a nuclear arsenal, that it has a deterrent value, and not using it, but just having it limits the escalation of violence in an armed conflict. So that's why you have that slide. I wanted to bring that to your attention. That's one thing that the Red Cross is pushing forward a lot, to actually have an official ban on the nuclear weapon. So with the negotiating process that result in treaty banning landmines and cluster munition, like-minded governments should work in close partnership with civil society to bring about a nuclear weapon ban, regardless of resistance from state possessing the weapon. It's a highly political fight, but it's also very relevant in the humanitarian world. And I wanted to put that in perspective into the arsenal of weapons: biological, chemical, incendiary weapon, and then you have the nuclear weapon. You have all of that corpus of law that applies, and we're still seeing it. We're still seeing it used in the theater of operation, especially in Syria. So it's something we need to consider. I wanted to have maps because it's always useful to have maps. So you have the Syria on top with the general Middle East map between Turkey and Iraq. And I have a few smaller maps because I think that's also an element. War being waged in cities is not necessarily the same thing as the Iraq war that we saw on CNN in the desert. It's very, very different. So you do have the maps of the northern Syria with Aleppo on top, and an actual map of the district with the significant fighting. It's a bit dated, it's 2012, but it does show you how it hits a little bit closer to home, because it looks like a map of any kind of neighborhood, and it's a different setting for waging war. Accountability mechanism. That was something that I was asked to tackle in the presentation. So it would be a little bit more in terms of the interaction between international humanitarian law and international criminal law. From sorry. Here we go. I don't know if you lost it, but my screen went blank. Okay, so accountability mechanism. International criminal law is not the same thing as international humanitarian law. Because international humanitarian law will address how you wage war in a theater of operation. International criminal law will address the violation and will look at the accountability mechanism. So that's just what I want to bring to your attention, that mechanism between those two corpus of law that are, of course, complementary, but not necessarily the same. So we have a few slides on that to give you a clearer idea of how to wage it. So prevention and accountability in IHL. So there's responsibility for committing or ordering to commit. So a superior responsibility, a command responsibility, not just the person actually doing it, but the person organizing it. I would say that's That's something that comes from Nuremberg or even before, but having the superior responsible as well. There are effective penal sanctions that you'll find embedded in the Geneva Convention. So these are the common article. They're not the same number, but 40, 50, 100, 129, and 146. These are all the four same article that you find in the Geneva Convention for penal sanction. It will also be linked to universal jurisdiction. So, enforce, either punish or extradite war criminals. So you have those sanctions that are effective within the Geneva Convention. And then you have the Rome Statute. So for that, I'll move to the next slide so you do have the information. So the Rome Statute is it's not an international humanitarian law treaty per se. It's the statute that is creating the first ever international permanent tribunal for international crimes. So the international crimes are could be a little bit broader than what you can find. It could be a little bit broader than what you can find just in the Geneva Convention. For instance, the crime of genocide does not necessarily need to be committed in the terms of armed conflict. Crime of extermination, crime against humanity are not necessarily linked with the international or non-international armed conflict, but it's very complementary. So right now, I'll just give you a few stats on the International Criminal Court. You have 124 states that are party to the Rome Statute. And right now you have Lubanga, Bemba, Katanga, and Almadi that have been convicted. And now I'm going with my memory, but Bemba is very key in rape as a weapon of war. Lubanga for child soldier, Almadi for destruction of civilian property and even protected buildings. So these are the conviction. But one thing that's also very interesting is all the conviction, if you set aside some procedural judgment for witness, they all have been convicted for war crimes. As you say, war crimes can only be committed in times of war, in times of armed conflict. So that goes back to the Geneva Convention that I mentioned earlier. So that's the interplay that you have. Maybe for the stats, so you have 31 states that have signed the Rome Statute but not yet ratified it. You'll see it. I have a map in a couple of slides that you can look at. 33 arrest warrant and 22 cases in 10 situations. I'll just bring it back to previous slide. So that's the link here. The Rome Statute at Article 8, and it's a very long article if you're used to navigating the Code Criminel, the penal code, that's the kind of the structure that you have. That's for the war crimes. So for the purpose of the statute for the International Criminal Court, war crimes means grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. So that's the breaches that I mentioned. Namely, any of the following acts against persons or protected property protected under the Geneva Convention. So that's willful killing, torture or inhumane treatment, including biological experiment, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property, not justified by military necessity. It comes back to those principles that I've discussed with you earlier, and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, and compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of an hostile power. So that's the definition of war crime that you'll have in international criminal law in the front of the ICC. So here you have a map of the International Criminal Court participation. In dark green, you have those states that accepted the ICC jurisdiction. You have those who withdrew. So the US withdrew, so they signed and then they withdrew afterwards. You have non-state party to the ICC. You can see there is a situation with Asia and some states that we have no data. So that's the picture you have of state party to the Rome Statute. And now you have situation under investigation. It's not, I think there's Georgia missing for situation under investigation and one or two in preliminary examination, but that's more or less accurate. So there's all those situations. So you will have a strong reaction of saying, well, is the ICC only a court for crimes committed in Africa? So there is a movement on that, and that's something that we can discuss. Maybe you know that the African Union drafted a resolution to ask for the states to actually pull out of the Rome Statute, and you can have a very interesting discussion. Although, as I mentioned, that's more international criminal law than humanitarian law. if you want to talk about it in the question period, I'll be more than happy. But it's to give you an idea of what's going on in the world that we live right now. That's the portrait. That's Africa, so you can actually see the different countries where the investigations are ongoing. You have Sudan, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali. It's a lot of. The third focus that I want to do with you, Sir. Oh, you should be on time. I should be on for another 6 minutes, and then we can move on to question period. So the focus will be on attacks on healthcare providers in armed conflict. So the pictures that you have here, the first one, the big one on top in the middle, I'm pointing at my screen, but that's not very useful for you. This is the one of the few remaining hospitals in Aleppo, Syria, damaged or destroyed recently. Most recently, 6 of these very few remaining facilities in Aleppo have been destroyed, and several patient and healthcare professionals killed, including the last pediatrician there. So they have no more pediatricians. This has dire consequences for the trapped population, with access to badly needed healthcare more and more in existence. So according to an annual report from the World Health Organization in 2015, almost 60% of healthcare facilities in Syria are no longer functional. 60%, as they have been closed, damaged, or just destroyed. At the same time, around 25,000 were wounded every 2015 due to hostilities, many of whom gravely, and children immunization program have been gravely jeopardized. So the second picture that you have here is a hospital bed. That's in Yemen. So 3 patients who have been lying in the room were pulled out of their bed when the shelling started. So you have that room. Those pictures. I brought back the map for Syria because I mentioned it to you, so you can actually visualize it. As I mentioned, the protection of healthcare personnel is really, really key, not just as a self-interest for the Red Cross, because we do deploy a lot of health services in situation of armed conflict, but also because it impacts very gravely the whole population. You'll see in the slide. So I want to give you a few stats and then move on to the actual bigger impact that it has to actually have violence against healthcare delivery. So it's a global humanitarian problem. More than 4,200 people were victims of violence against healthcare between 2012 and 2014. And over 50% of attacks were around or inside healthcare facilities. That's really a change. I mean, that's not something that was envisioned in 1949 and not even in 1977. It's something that's new, that actually targeting those healthcare facility, really going after the civilian population. So close to 600 healthcare workers were killed, beaten, or wounded, and over 700 medical transport were affected directly or indirectly. So why is that important? That's what we call the knock-on effect. So attack on healthcare facilities, healthcare personnel, and medical vehicle, and impediment to the wounded and the sick reaching healthcare services have become common in those conflicts these days. And they provoke far-reaching secondary consequences as healthcare professionals, they flee their posts, hospitals get closed, and vaccination campaigns come to a halt. So the knock-on effects leave entire communities without access to adequate services. Violence, actual violence, but also threats of violence, just the fear of violence against patients and healthcare workers and facility is one of the most crucial yet overlooked humanitarian issues today. So violence against healthcare has tremendous consequences. Fighting in the vicinity of healthcare facilities, it prevents access to them, to the wounded and the sick, healthcare staff, and the vehicle carrying essential and medical. So that if there's fighting, there's no way you can actually transport and get to the facility. And fighting can also disrupt water and electricity supplies and prevent fuel deliveries reaching backup generators. So it does have a bigger effect. So what does the law say about the protection of a healthcare worker? So this is what is contained in the Geneva Convention and International Humanitarian Law, coming back to the responsibility of the state to actually address those issues. Patients must benefit from impartial healthcare required by their condition as rapidly as possible. There's no threat against or harassment of healthcare personnel performing activities in the line with ethical principle of healthcare. No attacks against healthcare facilities performing their function, and no undue delays. So these are the, if you like looking at the convention, that's Article 50 of Additional Protocol 1 and Article 71, which gives you a specific protection for personnel participating in relief action. You also have mention here of the rules of the ICRC study on customary law. We can discuss the value of this study. It states what the ICRC considers rules of customary law. It's a very extensive and very impressive study. The value itself of the study has been questioned, as the state do question the value of the rules contained in this study, as they don't necessarily agree with the methodology that was adopted. If that's a subject that's of interest to you, we can talk about it, because that's part of my doctoral thesis. But probably we won't be addressing the subject tonight. But if you want, I'd be more than happy to discuss it with you. So the last focus before we move on to the question period is something that is, I think it's the most urgent situation we need to tackle in the humanitarian world today, is war at the root of hunger. So the situation in Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia, as we're speaking now. So that affects 20 million people. 20 million people is a lot of people. So long-term conflict is a common factor linking all of those crises. The emergency is man-made. In the Horn of Africa, drought is also a central cause, with mass livestock death in Somalia devastating entire communities. In Yemen, it's kind of a perfect storm that's brewing. Only 45% of healthcare structure are functioning. In one city, Odeda, the water system is on the verge of collapsing, threatening nearly 500,000 people. Desperate need goods such as food and medicine are blocked from entering the country. So following a recent upsurge in fighting in Yemen, the ICRC increased its medical assistance by 250%. In South Sudan, it's estimated that out of 3 households is in urgent need of food. In Nigeria, Borno State, 300,000 children are expected to suffer from severe acute malnutrition over the year. Same thing in Kenya. So why I'm talking about this, the international community and the humanitarian community as well is offering assistance, is offering food, and this will increase, but no money can actually alleviate the violation of the Geneva Convention in such circumstances. So you'll see in memorandums that what I just read to you was a press release from the RCRC, is saying we need to push the state to actually respect their obligation, especially in those situations, because the impact will be much, much bigger, and we'll have a very, very high price to pay if we let all of those interaction. Violation of the Geneva Convention is really something that, of course, the Red Cross movement can try to tackle it by doing prevention and dissemination and hosting seminars with students like you, but also with the armed forces in the bush. But the states really need to take on their responsibility in enforcing the Geneva Convention and different settings that you'll find in that framework. That's another map, so you can have it for the different. So you have Yemen, that's close to the Horn of Africa. So sometimes it's interesting because Yemen for us is not Africa, but it's very closely linked. So that's why there's a situation of drought and famine. So to close with, I think it was mentioned to me that to say a few words about what is the role of the International Humanitarian Law Advisor at the Canadian Red Cross. That's not a position I'm currently holding, but I know enough that I can share a few thoughts with you and tell you a little bit more. If you have a question on more practical side of the work, I would be more than happy. Part of the job is to deliver training such as the one we're doing right now and with the military forces. But in a broader spectrum, that role, so working for the Canadian society, so it covers the whole country. It fits in the mandate as a national society. So the Red Cross is a national society, and it has a mandate to disseminate international humanitarian law. So that's a big role of the IHL advisor. It also aims at working with the governments, so federal governments, but also provincial authorities, to ensure IHL as as per the statute of the movement. So it's a joint effort between national society and the RCRC, and what more we can do in order to contribute to the knowledge and compliance of IHL. So it's really working together also with the International Committee of the Red Cross. They have an office in Washington that's a regional delegation. So they're not necessarily operational, although they were when Guantanamo was having detainees, so the delegation would visit them, but that delegation ensures the work of the RCRC and the National Society within its regional scope, the regional scope being the US and Canada. It's a collaborative effort with the government, the Canadian military, so we work very closely with the JAG, the Judge Advocate General, and also all of the pre-deployment mission to make sure that they understand the role of the Red Cross. They do have very high-level training on IHL, but those discussions on how we interpret the rule and how we apply in the field is also very fruitful and necessary in my perspective. Also a collaborative effort with the civil society across the country in order to increase awareness, understanding, and commitment to the principle which underlies international humanitarian law. So that's it for me. That's my presentation. I think we're on, I overlapped a little bit. I'm sorry about that, but we can, I'm still on to take any question. I left my email address if you have any question, but aside from that, I'll leave the floor to you, and I want to thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to hear about you.
So much, Sophie. We will give you a round of applause, but I think I am going to hold it for a second. We do have a question online, so I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa to read that out. And in the meantime, think of your question.
Chemical weapons were used in Syria. How can or will the international humanitarian law be enforced, and how does IHL apply and enforce the IHL to the countries that supplied the chemical weapons?
That's an interesting question. Enforcement of IHL, and as you see, you'll see me wearing my PhD student hat. The question is not necessarily regarding IHL. It's the very philosophical question: is how you deal with somebody that cheats. People are cheating rules that already exist. The enforcement of use of chemical weapon, I think it's a key issue because the accountability mechanism. As I said, it links with the International Criminal Court, so it's possible. I think you can fit it in, and I apologize in advance because I'm not a specialist in international criminal law, but you can actually find in war crimes and crimes against humanity sections that can actually address the accountability for those people. So you would need to go through the whole preliminary examination and going through the mechanism of the International Criminal Court. You might even have set up some ad hoc mechanism which were set up for former Yugoslavia, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda. So you have those mechanisms of accountability, and you have the permanent court in front of the ICC. But most of the sanctions that we think about when we talk about enforcement, usually they're within the realm of political decision. So it's usually up to the UN, and the mechanism, I mean, we can question it and we can challenge it. But just having those mechanisms of maybe excluding, or the whole dynamic of the Security Council, I think all of those solutions are complementary. And one of the problems we have in humanitarian law is when there's a violation of humanitarian law, the body of law already failed. So, I mean, use of chemical weapon, it's already a failure from a humanitarian perspective. Even if we have accountability, that's something that we definitely want to have. But in terms of a body of law, that's something we need to limit. In terms of, I know that for dealing weapons, a big issue is how do you provide them, who sells them, who buys them. So there's a whole contentieux. There's a whole group of subjects that actually deal with kind of naming and shaming state. But as I said, these are more diplomatical and political measures. They're not within the realm of, strictly speaking, IHL. That's why I made that link with the International Criminal Tribunal, as it is one of the option. And well, of course, I mean, from a perspective of the Red Cross, the RCRC will definitely bring that point, because you have to remember that the RCRC is present in the field and engaged with the armed groups that are present. So they're definitely going to bring it up with the armed forces. But as I said, it comes back to the same question. If somebody cheats, how can you deal with that? It's somebody that knows the rules but don't want to respect them. That's a question. So I'm giving you little bits and pieces of advice on that. And I'm in a situation where IHL is not necessarily the body of law that addresses very specifically, and definitely not comprehensively the situation of accountability for a violation, be it for use of prohibited weapon or commission of war crimes or whatnot.
Hello. Hi, Sophie.
Hi.
Okay, so I want to ask a question regarding terrorism. I know IHL specifically mentions and prohibits measures of terrorism or acts of terrorism. My question is, do some aspects of the fight against terrorism amount to a transnational armed conflict?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you very much for the question. So you're right. The Geneva Convention and more specifically the additional protocol do prohibit spreading acts of terror. So it's really the act of terror, meaning that you're going to spread fear in the civilian population. That's the definition of terrorism. So that's a way of waging war that's prohibited, and it can take place within an armed conflict or not. So the fight against terrorism is something that, or war, I think it was global war on terrorism. So in 2005, I think it was the Quad. That's not a concept that that exists in IHL. We have international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. The way that you present your question was pretty much how we tackle it. Sometimes in situation of armed conflict, you'll have act of terrorism that will contribute to the qualification of either a non-international armed conflict or an armed conflict. It's just that we have those two categories, and the notion of terrorist is not a notion that we have in IHL. It's a very binary system. You have combatants and non-combatants. In combatants, you might have people that in other systems you would refer to as terrorists, but in IHL, you don't need those qualifications. You're either a civilian or you're a combatant. It has different name depending if it's a non-international armed conflict or an international armed conflict, but it's always those pieces, very, very binary. So yes, I think it depends. In IHL, rules are very simple and application is very complex. So yes, acts of terrorism can amount in a specific setting to a transnational or an international armed conflict. That's possible, but it's not automatic. So it's part of waging war. It's part of the means and methods of warfare, and it's definitely prohibited as a method of warfare, and it could be part of a qualification of international armed conflict.
Can I just get you to actually show your full screen, Neil, again? We can see your picture.
Do you want me to do what?
Can you?
Sorry. Do I need to stop sharing this? Oh, is that so? Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Hi, Sophie. So my question's a little bit more specific. So within the past, I think it's been 2 years in the Philippines, there's been a lot of concern regarding the president's kind of war on crime and the questions regarding his actions on a humanitarian stance. Can you give a little bit of perspective regarding IHL's kind of stance on that and kind of maybe where the Red Cross stance is and the different things that could be done or are being done?
That's a really good question. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, in terms of the situation in the Philippines, I'm not up to date. I'm based in Ottawa and Montreal, so I can't really tell you. I know that the RCRC is present in the field, and they are conducting. The mandate that I described to you as protection work and work in peacetime, and in the Philippines, it's kind of at the threshold of those two situations. The RCRC is present, but the fact is. And I won't be, and I'm very sorry about that. I won't be able to provide you with more information, but the dialogue that the RCRC has is confidential with the authorities. So it's not something you'll read in reports. It's not something you'll see in the news, but I know there's work being done at this point. If I had expertise in the field or people, a delegate coming back, I would be able to share that with you. I don't know if anybody in the room knows the work of the Red Cross in the Philippines. Feel free to share that with your colleague in the room. But I know there is the same kind of protection work that's been done, but unfortunately, I don't have more information. If you want, I can look it up and I can send it to your professor, and I can send you a quick update. I know that the RCRC does that, so I can do that right after the conference if you'd like.
Other questions? I have a question, Sophie. Thank you so much for the overview you've given us. You talked a little bit earlier about the importance of the political environment that you're working in. Can you talk about what are some of the mechanisms, particularly to an audience that's relatively new to international law and might be more aware of how domestic law works? So what are the mechanisms the international community has to hold people to account?
So mechanism of accountability. That's a little bit outside of the realm of international humanitarian law, but you do have, first maybe I can set the stage regarding international law itself. As you say, international law is very different than domestic law. Domestic law is a right what we call it's a regime of subordination. So you know about the Grundnorm, and you're under the auspices of a constitution or the government, and you actually give that power. International law, be it humanitarian, environmental, banking law, whatever, it's a law of coordination. So it's really the states that decide to do whatever they want. They don't have a police, they don't have a tribunal, they just make rules to apply to themselves, and everybody's treated equal. So that's a Westphalian conception of international relationship, where sovereignty of the state is really, really a key element, and everything is based on that. So consent of the state to abide to rules is really a centerpiece of that core of the regime of coordination more than subordination. So no state is stronger than another one. As you can probably imagine, that's not the reality. That's kind of a fiction that we have in international law, and more it's being challenged. So more and more we see what we call the international community, the United Nations, the civic society, and so on, trying to say, well, that's what international law is. It's about the people. It's not necessarily about the state. So we're in that period in the 21st century where it's kind of evolving. The states still have the realm of rights and responsibility, but they're not necessarily being held accountable. And when we can actually get them to be accountable, it's through international criminal law, but also more sanctions as part of the UN. So you have all the mechanism for human rights set up at the UN, for the Human Rights Committee, Committee Against Torture, all of those mechanisms that are actually being set up where the states, it's kind of their family meeting. So that's where they go, and people actually question them. There's a periodical review for all the states where all of their human rights are being questioned. You have a special rapporteur at the UN that actually visit different states and address issues of forced disappearance, use of weapon. So the UN is really kind of the hub where you have all of those mechanisms happening regarding human rights. In terms of international humanitarian law, as I mentioned, it's the interplay with the international criminal law element with the ICC, and I think that covers it. Maybe was there one specific thing you wanted me to mention regarding accountability mechanism?
That's good. Are there other questions in the room? Okay, I have one last question. Again, you've talked about a really good set of examples here in terms of use of chemical weapons, the attacks on healthcare workers, the emerging issues around hunger and famine in the world. It seems to me that we are seeing quite a significant change in the way war is being waged in the world. Do you have a final thought about that and what that might look like going forward in the next few years or decades? Little question.
I like that question. Well, as you can see, you've just spent the whole hour just listening to me. I'm kind of an optimistic person. I believe, but very also, it takes a lot of humility and a lot of optimism to do humanitarian law, because you need to understand that once the moment that war has actually happened, there was a failure of humanity at one point. You need to deal with that. You need to still say, well, we need rules to actually limit the way we wage war, and then we can save part of humanity. But I'm very optimistic. As I mentioned, I mean, that's really what I believe. So I'm not just saying that if the rules that we already have, we really work strongly to respect them, we will have pieces where we won't agree and some things that won't be protected. But the fact that we managed to have that consensus at one point of our recent history, 1949 is not that far ago, it's a big, big success. And one of the things that I hear a lot in conferences and papers these days, there's no way we could have that today. there are so many states. I mean, in 1949, there was no Asian state actually involved at the UN. The Europe was really, really weak, so Canada took on a big role. So there were not a lot of players. Right now, we could not have the Geneva Convention, but we do have them. So of course, they kind of address a reality that's a bit different. Non-state armed groups are really an issue that's hard to tackle. As I mentioned, international law is just state versus state. And one example that I can give you, and I think it's interesting, is one of the reasons why ISIS is not considered a state. It's mostly because they don't want to. It doesn't appeal to them. There's so much responsibility. They rather take on another side. So that's one of the problems we need to tackle. But we have that corpus of law that can actually push forward. And if we push it, we'll have protection of population, civilian population, and also combatants that are hors combat. They're going to be protected, and all the humanitarian personnel as well. So I think that's a set of rules that's definitely useful. It needs, I mean, as I said, it takes a lot of humility because there will be many other situations where we might not see it. But for the prohibition of chemical weapons and biological weapons and such, I mean, we have those tools. We have something to say. It's not just us. It's not the Red Cross saying that it's not right. We have those conventions, and we have heads of states in the last 100 years that actually officially proclaimed that it was something that was horrific and that should not be used. So we already have something that's very solid that a lot of other fields don't have. We have that, but it still is something that is weak. First, for the reason of people that want to cheat, they don't want to respect the rules. It's how we position ourselves regarding those rules. And at the same time, it's really pushing for that from a humanitarian perspective. It always comes back to my slide with the two hands, with the military consideration and the humanitarian consideration. I think for me, it's a nice way to spend my life to actually push always for the humanitarian consideration, even if sometimes the results are not coming in, or maybe the results are way less than what we were expecting. It's all about the process for me.
Sophie, thank you. We have an additional question that kind of leverages off of what you've just said. Joanne's asking, I'm going to interpret this a little bit, but I think what she's asking is there a need to change the Geneva Convention at this point, given that we have so many changes in terms of the use of different types of weapons of war and changing types of war? Is it possible and is it necessary to have Geneva Convention 2020 or something like that?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think one of the first elements, and it's kind of picking up on what I said, if we are reopening it, I would be, and that's me, that's not the Red Cross speaking, but I would be worried that we would lose protection. The protection that we currently have are pretty high in comparison to other protection that could be used. So reopening it and asking state to reopening it, meaning that you can lose some and you can have some, maybe that's not a good idea. And also you can see in my presentation, I didn't really focus on specific article. Principle of distinction, principle of precaution, proportionality. Everything could be built in that. I mean, the principle of distinction and proportionality, all of those new weapons, they can be built on that. It depends on the way that you interpret the clauses, that you actually look at the different negotiation that took place when they were adopted in the treaty. But we do have a lot of material to build on that because the wording was so lofty. I mean, I think that's the thing with humanitarian consideration. If I was talking to you about investment or banking law, it wouldn't be a lot of common sense. But humanitarian law, it tackles that. And it does touch upon, and it's problematic from a theoretical perspective, in natural law. So something that feels right, even beyond the realm of legal norms. But humanitarian law, so the Geneva Convention, they have that embodied. So if you look at all the clauses, if you look at Common Article 3, I can actually, and that's my interpretation, and I've been studying that body of law for the last 15, 20 years. I think that all of those new ways of waging war that we didn't thought of when was drafted Article 3, we can still find a way to put them in and find a rule that actually limits the conduct of hostilities. As I mentioned, I think it's also a matter of good and bad faith. I mean, using a nuclear weapon, I don't think that any state would actually say that using a nuclear weapon, would respect the principle of proportion and distinction. No state would argue that. They want to keep it in their arsenal as a political deterrent, but they're not going to argue on that. So you do have all of those rules that can be respected, and reopening the convention, I think, might be focusing our energy on something that is not needed. That being said, I know that's something that other people can argue, and that would not be something that I would be that would oppose necessarily, but that would be my stance on it. As we can do a lot of mileage on what we currently have.
There final questions? Online? Okay. I do just want to take this time to really thank the Red Cross, the Canadian Red Cross, and also Sophie. That has been a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
And I really appreciate the time that you've put into it and the breadth of what you've covered in this hour and a half. It's been really fantastic. And I thank, again, the class of Justice Studies here at 404 for welcoming people into their class. And I thank everyone online for coming. I also have to acknowledge the fact that the Canadian Red Cross has received funding from the Canadian government to do these types of seminars, so they have requested that we do give some feedback to them, and the instructions are here on the board for you to follow in terms to give them some feedback on how that went. And I think that's it. And again, just want to say thank you very much, and can we give her a round of applause?
Thank you. It was a pleasure being with you. I would have loved to be there in person, but maybe next time. It was very lovely, and thank you very much for your question and your attention. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay.